Scripture reading tonight is going to come from Mark chapter 4. That's Mark chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 35 through 41. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
Good afternoon. It's good to see all of you here today. Before we start, I've got a couple announcements. VBS is this Saturday, the 29th. So everybody be sure to invite your friends, invite your neighbors, encourage your kids to invite their friends from school. We want to have a good turnout for that. And if you're involved with VBS, we're going to have a meeting in the small auditorium right after services. And that shouldn't take much time. So VBS, mark your calendars. I have noticed that it rains a lot here. It was pouring rain just 20, 30 minutes before church started. It rains just about every other night. And it was during one of those thunderstorms at night, and I got this song stuck in my head. It's one of my favorite songs. And so we're going to do something a little bit different. If you have your songbooks, open up to 423. This is a song that I think really captures the story that was told, that was read in Mark. I think it does a good job capturing the emotions involved. So let's sing number 423. We'll do the first and third verses. Master, the tempest is raging, the billows are tossing high. The sky is o'ershadowed with blackness, no shelter or help is nigh. Carest thou not that we perish? How can thou lie asleep, when each moment so madly is threatening a grave in the angry deep? The winds and the waves shall obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. Whether the wrath of the storm-tossed sea, or demons or men, or whatever it be, no water can swallow the ship where lies the master of ocean and earth and skies. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, peace be still. Master, the terror is over, the elements sweetly rest. Earth's sun in the calm lake is mirrored, and heaven's within my breast. Linger, O blessed Redeemer, leave me alone no more. And with joy I shall make the blessed harbor, and rest on the blissful shore. The winds and the waves shall obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. Whether the wrath of the storm-tossed sea, or demons or men, or whatever it be, no water can swallow the ship where lies the master of oceans and earth and skies. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace be still, peace be still. They all shall sweetly obey thy will. Peace, peace be still. I think that song just does a great job capturing what it must have been like for the disciples in this circumstance, what it must have been like for Jesus. I think what I can get out of this thing, what immediately pops out to me is two different things. When I read this story, when I listen to that song, I can't help but think of the power of nature. Whether you're looking at an object like a redwood tree that can grow to be some 100 yards around and weigh up to 4 million pounds, or whether you're looking at a natural disaster like a tornado or a tsunami, earthquake, hurricane, the amount of power and force that's behind those, it's incomprehensible, it's overwhelming. And the second thing that I really get out of this story is that it's a very human story. I think often we look at stories in the Bible, we look at passages and we just see it as a story. We don't see it as real people. We don't often see it as, this is something that actually happened. What must have been going through these people's minds? How must they have felt? What would they be dealing with? But this is a story where you can see a full range of emotions. So if you have your Bible, open up to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4. And let's look at the first thing is, if you look back a little bit, Jesus has spent a lot of time preaching. He's been preaching, he does the parable of the seed, parable of the mustard seed, and let's read the first couple verses of chapter 35, or verse 35. On that day when evening came, he said to them, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." Leaving the crowd, they took him along with the boat, and just as he was, and the other boats were with him. And then you see that Jesus is sleeping in the boat. I can just imagine how tired Jesus must have been. Jesus was a human. Jesus was a person just like me, just like you. And I'm sure that he was exhausted. He'd spent a whole day preaching and teaching, and I'm sure he's just tired. And so he goes off into this boat with the disciples, and they get away from the crowd for a little bit. And then there's that storm that we know about. The storm comes and it's got waves and it's got wind, and the boat starts to take on water. And I can just imagine the fear the disciples must have had. They were scared for their lives. They were helpless. There wasn't anything they could do to save themselves. And so I can just imagine that kind of primal fear that they must have had. Their life could have ended right then, and there's nothing they could have done to save themselves. And then we know that Jesus calms the storm, and I can just imagine the relief that they must have felt. This danger that was about to kill them, this opposing threat, it was gone. And so I'm sure they must have just felt such relief that they'd survived the storm. And then gratitude towards Jesus. And I think that it also touches on it. They must have felt some incredible awe. This Jesus, this man who they've been traveling with, he has the ability to calm the storm. He has the ability to calm those winds, to calm the waves. He didn't do it in some spectacular event. He did it very simply by telling them to calm. So with just a couple words, Jesus could tame the elements. And so I think that this is a very human story. You get to see the humanity of Jesus. You get to see the humanity of the disciples. And I think that you can see them as real people. So let's draw some lessons from this story. And the first lesson that I think is notable is that it's good to sometimes get away. At the very beginning, we said Jesus is withdrawing from the crowd. He's withdrawing from teaching all day to his boat with just him and a few disciples. Even when you have the most important job in the world, there's sometimes where you need to take some time to rest. Look at the life of Jesus. Jesus had the most important job. He had the most important mission that's ever been or ever will be. He was born to die. He was born to redeem sinners, then to redeem sinners now. And he had a limited amount of time to do it. He had a limited amount of time to teach, to spread the gospel, to spread God's will. And yet, you might think, well, he must have been about that every minute of every day. But here you see him taking some time to withdraw. And you see it throughout Jesus' life, throughout Jesus' ministry. Look in Luke chapter 4. This is the story of Jesus in the wilderness. And so at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he takes some time, 40 days and 40 nights, and he goes off by himself into the wilderness. And in that wilderness, he spends time fasting, he spends time praying, and preparing himself for the ministry that was to come. And so at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, he was taking time with himself, taking time with God. And throughout his ministry, we see that he does the same thing. In Mark chapter 4, this same story, we see that he withdraws from the crowd after teaching. And flip on over just a little bit. Let's read chapter 6 of Mark. Mark 6, verse 30. The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while." For there were many people coming and going, and they did not have time to even eat. They went away in the boats to a secluded place by themselves. And so when the apostles, or when the disciples had been teaching, Jesus says, take some time, regroup, spend some time in seclusion. And I think that's something that's important. I think it's important to sometimes take time to yourself. And then at the very end of Jesus' life, turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. And verse 36. Nearing the end of Jesus' life, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is what it says. Verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over and pray." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup be passed from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." And so, nearing the end of Jesus' life, he takes some time to pray. He takes some time to be alone with God. And at first, he brings his closest friends with him. He brings the kind of inner circle of the disciples with him. And then he goes on a little farther to be alone with God. I think that there's a lot that can be learned from this. If Jesus valued seclusion, if Jesus valued solitude, then I think that we should value solitude. Maybe it's good for us to unplug from our busy lives, to put our schedules aside sometimes, to get off the social media and to spend some time just alone with God, to spend some time in prayer. And I think something else that's really notable in this story is the fear of the disciples. I understand their fear. I can connect with it. They're in the midst of this huge storm. The wind's blowing, the waves are rocking the boat. The boat starts to take on water, and they're just kind of sitting ducks. There's nothing they can do to help themselves. They can't stop the storm any more than a duck could. But despite how hard, I imagine them trying to scoop the water out of the boat, but despite their efforts, despite how hard they may have been working, there's only so much they could do. They couldn't calm the storm by themselves. They couldn't control the winds. And so they begin to despair. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to die. We're taking on water. We can't help ourselves. And so, as a last resort, they turn to Jesus. Turn back to Mark chapter 4. Look at verse 38. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep in the cushion, and they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" And so, when all seemed lost, they wake up Jesus and say, "Are you just going to let this happen? Do you not care that we're going to die unless something happens?" And so, keep reading. It says, and he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea and said, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And so I think that looking at this upon first inspection, this rebuke that they receive seems kind of odd. Jesus says, "Why don't you have faith?" But to me, it seems that they may have had faith. They went to Jesus. So why would Jesus then rebuke them? Why did Jesus say, "You of little faith"? Why do you still have no faith? Well, I think the answer is that they didn't trust in Jesus all along. I think that they didn't trust from the beginning that Jesus could or would save them from this. They despaired when they should have trusted. And I think that there's a lesson to be learned from this. They came to Jesus as a last resort. And I think that that's something that we often do as well. We handle things ourselves for as long as we can. We try to take care of everything. That American pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And we only rely on God when things get bad. We only rely on God when we're in debt, when we have a test coming up tomorrow, when it's a last minute thing. But that's not how it should be. We need to have a prayerful life. At the ending of James 5:16, it says those famous verses that say, "The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much," or "The effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much." Prayer is not something that should be used exclusively as a last resort. It's not something that we should just use as our backup plan. It should be our go-to plan. We need to pray before, we need to pray during, we need to pray after. Pray without ceasing. And so, if we have prayer as our first line of defense, if we believe, if we don't despair, if we just trust in God, then I think things will be better. And so the next lesson that I want to draw from this is Jesus' power and his control. Let's look at 3 verses. Turn to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. Let's read the first 3 verses of this book. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has ever come into being." And so this is a verse proclaiming the deity of Christ. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so we see that later on that the Word took on flesh and dwelt among us. So that Word is Jesus. In the beginning, Jesus was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. And all things were created through Jesus. Flip on over to Colossians. Colossians chapter 1. Let's read verses 15 and 17. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And so again, we see that Jesus is the creator of all things. He's the creator of things visible and invisible. He's the creator of thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities. He's in control. And one more. Turn to Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the world. And so a few weeks ago, we talked about how great it would have been to be there in the creation day. What it must have been like for those 6 days to be a spectator as God created heavens and the earth, as God created plants and animals, light and darkness. And I think that it's important to realize that God wasn't alone, that Jesus was there as well, that things were created through Jesus. And so, what makes me think of is a master craftsman. Take a watchmaker, for example. A watchmaker knows everything about that watch he's designing. He knows each and every intricate little part, how it should work, what it should do. And I think that's kind of how Jesus is. He understands the weather. He understands my problems. He understands your problems because he's God, because he created us, and he knows the workings. And so when that storm was blowing, when the disciples were beginning to despair, all it took was for Jesus to say, "Hush, be still." And the winds died down, the waves calmed, and the lives of the disciples were saved. And I think the final lesson that can be drawn from this is that there can be peace in the midst of a storm. It's inevitable that hard times will come in our lives. It's inevitable that we're going to go through the death of a parent or a loved one, that we'll have times where we'll be breaking up through our relationships. There's going to be times where we may lose a job, or there'll be times where we get a new job, have to move, uproot. There's going to be hard times in our lives, times where we need to rely on God. But I think a lesson that can be learned from the disciples is that when these hard times happen, when these hard times arrive, we can't just despair. We can't just throw our hands up and say, "Well, there's nothing I can do." We need to seek out God, but not as a last resort. We need to seek out God from the beginning. We need to seek out God in the middle. We need to seek out God in the end. Turn to Philippians chapter 4. Let's look at verses 6 through 7. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And so when those hard times arrive, when things seem that they can't get any worse, when you're stressed, when you're depressed, there can be calm in the midst of that storm. There can be a calm that only Jesus can provide. Matthew 6 talks about, it's the do not be anxious passages. It talks about, why are you worrying about your food? Why are you worrying about what you're going to drink? Why are you worrying about what you're going to wear? Because God provides. God provides for food for the birds. God provides clothing for the lilies. God's going to take care of you. And so when we have those storms, we need to trust that God can take care of us. If you're here tonight and you haven't put on Christ in baptism, if you haven't done what you need to do to be saved, if you want that peace of mind that only He can bring, or if you have been saved, if you have put on Christ in baptism and you need the prayers of the church, then come forward as we stand and sing.